Good evening, we're live. I'm Chris, and tonight I have Mark Windows on the programme. Now, we're going to talk about Mafia Councils. Now, first of all, if you go onto the internet and look up windowsontheworld.net, windowsontheworld.net, in one, you'll see Mark's website, excellent website, and he broadcasts live Sundays at 9 o'clock. And he's sometimes been sneaking in some live broadcasts in midweek, which he did this week. So I think it's Wednesdays. I think he did one at 9 o'clock. Now,
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's right. Now, what I'm about to talk about is if you go down your council, nowadays, and find out what's really going on, you're in for a surprise. Because they talk a lot about public consultation. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? But it isn't really the big part. And there's citizens' assemblies and things like that. And what's happening in your local council isn't quite what we're led to believe. Now, Mark, how did you get started in this? How did you first become interested and first think, what's going on in the local council? Something not quite right? Because I know with my local council, I went to a planning meeting, and I won't go into the full details of it, but it was a bit like the Muppet Show without the humour, because it was all cut and dried, and it wasn't democratic at all. And afterwards, the council were patting the back of the developers, all going down the pub together, and thought, oh, how jolly, how marvellous, because they're all in it. And if you look down outside in the local council, one of them is what they call it, public consultation. They're public consultants. So anyway, mate, Mark, how did you first?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just losing your volume there a bit. Yeah, thing is, what I noticed was that when I went to some of these council meetings years ago, there seemed to be something going on in the background that I couldn't quite put my finger on. In other words, there seemed to be some kind of steering process going on, which had already been put in place. Now, when I started looking into it, I found out that about 15 years ago, they started using a thing called the Delphi technique, which was developed by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s. And it's a way of controlling group consensus. Consensus means that it appears as though everyone's agreed. So if, say, you've got a company and you've got a very strong union in there, you don't want the union to get too much hold. This is from a corporate point of view, right? So what you would do is you would bring in people to control the narrative. In other words, the narrative would already be set and set within certain parameters. And as we go more and more into this global governance system, it's becoming more and more obvious. So in other words, the culmination of all that is a thing called citizens' assemblies, which are not democratic at all. And we can get into why they're not democratic. But basically, this Delphi technique is how all public consultation is run. You've got a facilitator and a co-facilitator. You're split up and you're put onto tables. And then you're given limited choices. The outcome's already decided. So it'd be, for instance, like, how much more cycling would you like to see in your area? Do you think there's too many cars? These are sort of loaded questions, right? So in other words, you're already being steered into an outcome. And saying this, for example, in the citizens' assemblies, the idea, the theory of anthropogenic global warming cannot be discussed because it's a given. In other words, all we're going to talk about is how much money we're going to get out of you for mitigation. So once you strip this down to what it is, a corporate kind of way of thinking, it becomes much more obvious. Now, what it is really is a very simple way of controlling public opinion. So in other words, you already have your outcome and they're steered into it. And everything that the council puts out and all of their partners are already steering people into this outcome. So in other words, you're going to get people who are chosen. So they're not randomly chosen, really. And I think you had some experience of that, didn't you, Chris?
That's right. Yes. I mean, I've had two experiences of it. As far back as the 1980s, I had the experience of it. And that was up in the Midlands, where I was helping someone with a development, well, opposing a development, let's put it that way. And what happened is the developer realised, I mean, there was a site that was an area of natural beauty, and they knew that everybody would be against it. So they got some PR consultants in who were there to help the local community. And they came in with little badges, Stephen and Sandra, and also nice and gentle, and they were going to fight against what was proposed that was an industrial complex. And they fought and fought and fought and fought. And they said, "Oh, we're so relieved we're going to have a housing estate instead. Isn't that better for you all?" And they turned public opinion that way. But what's happened locally is that in 2013, there was a proposal. I mean, I live in the Green Belt, to build 63 houses. And around locally, everyone was against it, with the exception of a few. That is local to where I live, about 20, 30 families. And the police had to be called in. There was a protest outside the local council. They had banners and all this, and balloons, and there was a big protest about it. Now, there's plans to build 320 properties, not on the same piece of land, but over a spread over larger. And do you know how many people have objected locally? 4.
Yeah. It's called controlling the narrative of public opinion. Yeah.
And they've got a PR consultant in, and it's brilliant, because what they've done is they've put circulars round. Do you want to see more cycling? Do you want a better bus service? Do you want a better this, better that? Do you want local shops? Do you want this? And it's all, and when I went to the council, it was, and I put in a 25-page report with a lot of research in it, totally ignored, never said a word about it. You can't speak, you have to go through a councillor, but none of the councillors were interested in speaking for you. So you just sat there, and it was all cut and dried. And at the end, as I said earlier, they went out, patted the back of the local councillors who were in on it, and that was it. And they said that 70% of people are for this development. And how'd you go from a mass protest in 2013 to 70% of people wanting more houses in just a few years? And it's like you said,
the narrative basically that these consultations aren't real. In Waltham Forest, for instance, they said there was going to be a public consultation. Then they did a rollout of a thing called Mini Holland, which is basically what's happening everywhere. It's United Nations program, which is implemented through conferences called Habitat, and they have global governance summits every year. So local councils will say that's some kind of conspiracy theory, but they signed up for it in the year 2000, and it's called the Local Action Plan. Now, all of this stuff is already written into policy, and they've deregulated a lot of the selling off of council property. So in other words, if something's not being used locally, it gets sold off. So the council, in actual fact, haven't got that much say in what's going on anymore. They have corporate partners, as in Bechtel and Lendlease, who took over a lot of the London boroughs. Now, the thing is that with this consultation in Waltham Forest, they closed all the roads off for this thing called Mini Holland, and the Transport for London people who were manning the barricades when all this chaos was going on, because there was no real warning of what was happening. So in other words, what you do is you create the confusion. They're creating the confusion. So all the motorists are getting irate, and especially with each other, and everyone on the outside who wants to get rid of the cars is going, see how they all fight amongst each other, and how they hate cyclists, and how they're trouble, and how they're so aggressive. All this sort of stuff is manufactured. So basically you're manufacturing discontent, and then you're manufacturing your consent. So I noticed that it worked on a number of levels, but the Transport for London fella, because it's meant to come through Transport for London, it was meant to be the new idea of Mini Holland, and there was going to be one in Enfield and one in Kingston. And all of a sudden, you've won, we've won. Great, what we're going to get, oh, well, the road's closed, right? So basically what happened was I asked the fella from Transport for London, what it was all about. He said, well, 65% of people are already in favour. My boss at Transport for London told me. I said, well, that's very strange, because it's been the consultation's not till next week, So the consultation wasn't for another week, yet 65% were in favour. And that's about all you need to know. There is no public consultation. There is the appearance of a consultation, which is run by PR people. then you have these local councillors who are usually in bed with property developers. So that's worth looking into, because you'll find out that a lot of these councillors have got vested interests. So whose interests are they working for? It's not yours. It's for this greater good of what's happening, the common good, which is basically the smart city agenda. And this is happening all over the country. And your development is actually quite small. I was talking in Colchester last week, and there's a new development called Marks Tay, and that's going to be 45,000 houses. So they're basically creating a new city. And what this is all about is an agenda to get people out of the countryside and out of rural areas into these towns. So they're creating towns for people to go into. And it's a uniformity that's going on everywhere. So there is no public consultation. This is the main thing, that this illusion of public consultation is just that. There is no consultation.
Yes, it is an illusion. That you're 100% correct there. And what I've also noticed, and I speak about my own local council, they've now started their own property development or property company for rentals. So people will think, oh, I'm going to get nice executive homes built near me. So that must be very nice, because they're going to be posh people who read The Guardian and that type of thing. No, the council will buy that house up and move in umpteen families in there.
But this social engineering program is quite important, because what happened was 400,000 council houses in London were rebranded as brownfield. Now, not a lot of people know that. Well, brownfield land is dirty industrial wasteland. Where are those people going to go? London is prime property real estate, as stated by Savills. Yolanda Barnes, I think, from Savills. I've got it written down here. I made some notes on this ages ago because it's so interesting. But it was, she said basically that Savills, it's a thing called the City Villages document, which came out in 2014. And all of the council housing got rebranded as brownfield, which is dirty industrial wasteland. And there was a brownfield summit in 2016 where all of the council housing had already been sold off. So what happens then is you get the people who are getting funneled out of London, and where they're going to go. They're redistributing them all over the country, because the last thing that this agenda needs is for people to get together and realise what's gone on, because then they will start to resist it. And of course, with this system, they don't want resistance. So it's all psychologically worked out. It's worked out on every single level.
So it's your local council.
And let me just get rid of.
Yes, a local council.
Turn that off
You might not talk about
yeah, well, let me. It's quite interesting, the whole thing with local councils, and let's get on to the accountability thing, because many years ago they were much more accountable. In 10 to 15 years ago, that all changed about 5 years ago, and it started to get more draconian. And I remember when we started challenging them, first of all, you get responses. Now you don't get responses. And I was told 15 years ago in Waltham Forest, when I used to live there, an area of North East London, by one of the councillors, that the place was going to change irrevocably, and that the plans were already in place. And that was a councillor, I think it was Chris now, very high up, or he may even be the deputy leader of the council or something like that. But he was very high up as a councillor then. And it was just a flippant remark that he made at one of these council meetings. He said, the area is going to change irrevocably, the plans are already in place. Now, that was interesting, because when we're talking about this, we're not talking about something spontaneous. The council's not saying, how do you feel about something? This is part of an action plan that's been ongoing for 30 to 50 years. And the public don't understand that, because they're thinking in the short term. And what happens is you get these consultations as the kind of spontaneity about this. Well, of course, there isn't.
That's interesting. What you think this ongoing plan, excuse me, cutting in here, I was brought up on council and sort of neat suburb, and these houses were built in the 1920s, and it was like a little village. It was really nice. And I'm going back to the late 60s, 70s, I was very young then, and used to have the rent man come round back to the rent, and he said, take my tip, get out, because this place is going to change. The face of this place is going to change overnight, believe me. And we thought, oh yeah, because he said there's a plan in the local council. And again, I'm going back to the late 60s, early 70s. where they're going to move all the slum settlements out of London into these houses, and they've got a policy of putting the worst problem families next to the most decent, nicest people, hoping that then the decent, nicest people will change them. Well, that chap was 100%.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because yeah.
Absolutely overnight, and an elderly couple committed suicide. They couldn't stand it, and people walking around so in shock. I couldn't believe the place had just changed overnight.
This is because people are going to go, well, why does that happen? Well, the reason it happens is because there's an idea of a fracturing society. Now, the idea is this, that you don't want strong communities if you're going to implement these changes. Change is usually never popular with older people. So what they need to do is get them to shut up, which is what you've got at the moment. In actual fact, you've got this kind of focus on youth. In other words, you've got this Greta Thunberg. This might sound slightly obtuse, but it's not in a way, because what they're doing is once you program the youngsters, then they will go against the adults. So basically what you've got now is the adults will turn against the younger people, going, this is a load of crap what you're talking about, and it creates the necessary friction. So in other words, you empower one side against the other, and out of that you get a synthesis. It's called you get a thesis and an antithesis, and out of that comes a synthesis. This is all psychological control, and people don't think in these terms. But when you're thinking in terms of social engineering, we have to remember where all this really came from. It came from people who are social Darwinists, and social Darwinism is this belief in there are a society who should take on an administrative role, and there's a certain sector of society that should be the minister of the administrators. And a lot of these people who got into this idea of social Darwinism were very much into that idea. In other words, that there was different tiers of society. Now, how you actually cover that up is you then introduce this idea of things like communitarianism, which means that you've got this system in place which looks like it's a kind of democratic, or it's a system where all voices are heard. Well, it's actually nothing of the sort. It's a completely totalitarian system, but you can't sell a totalitarian system because it's got a bad name, right? So they're going to think like Chairman Mao or Stalin. But so you don't do that. What from my research of this, it's been very cleverly done, but it's very simply done. It's a simple concept. It's not complicated. So they're using basic psychology to divide and rule and use that as a decoy, where the real strategy is this control and management of the population. So in other words, when they talk about community doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed for, I mean, you might agree, Chris, but community doesn't exist, any community, like or even a society within the community. So basically what you've got is, if you want to impose a strict totalitarian system, the state has to be in full control. So the way the state becomes in full control is to divide and rule the population against each other, and then bring in the necessary outcome. So they introduce the conflict and they bring in the resolution. For instance, I think a lot of this violence that they've been promoting has been completely exaggerated to get this idea of fear for gated communities in London. And that was already kind of floated out. I remember years ago, very interesting actually, there's this poor lady who was living in the graveyard, and I think she had some kind of mental health problems. And this is the thing about yuppies, right? And people who move in, they feign all this kind of fake kind of sympathy when something horrible happens, but they won't do anything about it when it's on the doorstep. So this poor lady was living in the graveyard. She had mental health problems, and she got murdered. There was two drunks who were fighting, and she got in the middle of it, and she got murdered. And the next thing was, the council used it extremely cynically to get people to ask for CCTV in these areas around this area called Walthamstow Village. So they used that incident. Now, how far is that removed from creating incidents, right? Now, people are going to go, they wouldn't do that. Well, actually, this is a big part of it. So I think this introduction and encouragement of knife crime is a huge part of the social engineering. And the reason I say that is because when I lived in Walthamstow, you had a place called Walthamstow Village. Now, it was already called Walthamstow Village. It consisted of basically an old 16th century house and a Victorian postbox and a couple of pubs. It wasn't really a village, you know. but they trendified it. And what happened was with this mini Holland, when this closed all the roads, you got this idea of us and them. So in other words, they created this feeling of tension between what was outside and when you went in there. In other words, when you went into this paved place where people were walking around thinking it was Primrose Hill, then you got a different atmosphere. But outside that, the atmosphere changed. In other words, you had a feeling of going from one area into another area, and that other area was resented by the people outside it. So you've got this idea that, oh, all these yuppies have moved in, and they've taken, basically they can afford these property prices. We're all being pushed out. So that's part of it as well. So I think they're bringing in tensions within the cities, so they get this atmosphere where people are going to ask for it to be more of a police state than it already is. In other words, we'll need eye scanners to get in. We'll need surveillance. We need gated communities, and that's what I think it's about.
Spot on. Excuse me, chiming in here, but I've noticed that since the Berlin Wall's come down, and I believe the Soviets have moved from the east to the west because the oligarchs ran the Soviet system, and they've moved from the east to the west. Have you noticed that before the Berlin Wall came down, the word community was hardly ever used? I don't even remember it being used. People never said community. Now it's this community, that community. And I heard some ding dong the other day saying, I was in my garden and I was watching the ant community.
You were what?
He said, I was watching the ant community in my garden. The ant community. Bloody ant. I mean, everything is community, because what it is, it's a fake community that can be controlled by the government. And in the former Soviet Union, people don't realise it, people could vote. They voted for their local representatives, but the local representatives were chosen by the party. So,
yeah, there's no choice. Yeah.
You've got choice, but you haven't got choice. It's either Tweedledee or Tweedledum.
Well, I think that the use of the word community is very interesting, because you've got this idea of vibrant communities, right? Inclusivity. Now, social equity.
Sustainable.
When you define these terms, the word sustainable development, even by the person who's implementing it in Italy, one of the main people, Enrico Giovanni, who was at the Global Governance Summit, says, what does sustainable development mean? Everything and nothing. So it means anything that they want it to mean, right? So it doesn't really mean anything. The sustainable development is a mixture of development, which is the corporate sector, and sustainability, which is the environmental sector. So the bringing together of the two is sustainable development, but sustainable development is a business plan. And so when you're enforcing a technocratic system, which is what it is, it's based on technology, ultimately, and it's about control and management of population, you need to re-emphasize the idea that people have a community. In other words, that community is there when it's not. So the use of the word community is meaningless, and the idea of it really is a cover. It's a cover for what is really going on. And these are the sort of issues that we talk about when we take our talks around the real citizens' assembly. Actually, we call it the real citizens' assembly, because the citizens that have been imposed are fake. Yeah. And we can go back to it.
Now, your talks that you do, I believe they're called, what was it? The Bigger Picture. And you tour around the country, and I believe you're with Sandy Adams and Piers Corbyn, and so when where are you off to next? I mean, can you sort of give because they're really fantastic value for money. I mean, what can you get for 10 quid nowadays? That's brilliant, and you do get your money's worth. So, where are you off to next? What's your? I mean, I guess this will be on your.
We're at the Designer Academy in Hereford this Saturday. All the details on winnersontheworld.net, and it's £10 for the whole day. Apparently, it's selling quite well. What we're trying to do is get something. The word grassroots is another thing they use. Where anything that says community is not community. Anything that says grassroots is not grassroots. But we're trying to do the opposite. So in other words, we're going to do the real people's assembly. In other words, that's people who are really speaking their minds and lobbying councils, right? Because the people's assemblies, the citizens' assemblies that are being implemented are basically fake. They're all done like these council meetings. The agenda's already set. And basically, it's a way of bypassing government. And so we thought, well, we'll do the real people's assembly. And we encourage people to put them on in their own area. So in other words, what they do is the people organise them themselves, so they're real and they're organic.
Brilliant.
So you know, not us booking a venue and turning up; it's them booking a venue and us turning up. So what we do is tend to get people. Some people who listen to Winners on the World radio show turn up, but a lot of locals turn up. So what happens is you get this mixture of people, and I've noticed that the quality of the audience is very good because it's not like we just can preach into the converted, because that's never what I wanted to do, but it's all about people coming in and learning stuff, and it's a lot to take in a day. But what happens is, after we've all talked about how this stuff is implemented, why it's implemented, who's doing it and what for, some people are in a bit of shock, but then they can go away and look at it themselves. But the most important thing is afterwards, when we start talking to people, because what I found was that when I started looking into this in one place, the same template is happening everywhere, and it doesn't change. There's no change in the template. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Northeast London or you're in Cumbria. It's going to be exactly the same.
Yes, you're spot on there, yes. Well, I actually noticed that what you've been saying, I mean, I haven't got a television, I put it out years ago. But occasionally, I put this morning, I listen to BBC radio, local radio, the weather forecast. It's about the only thing they're good at. The
sound isn't very good, by the way. It keeps fading in and out. I just got a bit of problem with your sound.
How's that? Is that better?
Better. Yeah. Because
the microphone. What I've actually found is that, for example, on the news, it's always now we're going to talk about what are you doing to combat global warming. So they're assuming, which is, if you look at the real science and the proper science, it's a load of old waffle. There isn't global warming, it's global cooling, and it's nothing to do with what human activity, because it's more like believing that an ant with flatulence can warm your greenhouse. I mean, it's nonsense. And they're assuming things all the time. And the other one was, as we are so rich in this country now, how things are so much better than they were years ago, and how marvelous we are, and all that. And it's always assuming a situation, and this is what angers me. It's always they're always saying, like, today there's going to be a protest from Extinction Rebellion, and that's on the news, and they're going to close down this and do this and do that and do that. Now, if you or I were going to have a protest, we haven't got a mention on the news unless it was against us. And they're promoting this agenda all the time. And I should think quite a few other people listening in, they probably hear that as well. I think, sorry, maybe talk protest. How do you feel to stop global warming? Like, I don't know, using recycled toilet paper. I just made that up. But that type of thing. Have you noticed this on I should think you've noticed this on the media, Mark?
Yeah, well, the thing is, you see, that Extinction Rebellion isn't a protest group, it's a lobbying group. There's a big difference. It was set up and it came out of people who are actually directly involved with the intelligence services. And this isn't some conspiracy theory. This is a fact. I've studied it for a long time. I know for a fact that one of the directors of the company called Compassionate Revolution was involved in the removal of Brian Hoare and Barbara Tucker from Parliament Square. Now, people may not remember Brian Hoare, but he was there for many years protesting the Iraq War.
Brian Hoare, yes, I remember him.
So when I started looking into it, I found some of the old faces popping up from Occupy. Now, Occupy was taken over by George Soros money very quickly, and it turned into the climate change agenda. The money from Occupy went into a bank account for Climate Camp Action, and we made several films about this. One's called Inside Occupy and the Bank of Ideas. Let's not get onto the Bank of Ideas. We don't get too far away, but that was a fake squat set up at a Swiss bank in the city of London to basically take the heat off what was happening in St. Paul's with Occupy. So it was a diversion, and it was also a strategy that was the first time that I saw this controlled opposition type protest very close up. I'd seen it before, but I then saw the same template. And I can tell you one thing, the template for these protest groups is the same template that's going on in your local council. It's exactly the same. It doesn't deviate. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. So Extinction Rebellion is a lobbying group for globalist governance. One of their objectives is to basically destroy Western democracy. They actually say that in their aims, the inevitable collapse of Western democracy. Well, who said it was inevitable? Well, they did. So why are the government being pressured by this lobbying group when they're actually declaring a climate emergency on behalf of this lobbying group, which is funded by George Soros? Now, the thing is about it is that when we're talking about global policy, they go above national government. So in other words, this is a global action plan. It's nothing to do with local. It comes in locally, but it's a global thing. So what happens is this, right? The globalists, the people running it, and people go, this is some kind of conspiracy theory. No, it's not, because the present system that we're in came from the minds of two people and a third party. The two people were Edmund Rothschild and George Soros, with the help of a lady called Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway. And after that came a document called Our Common Future. Now, we haven't got time to go into all that, but what I can tell you is there's a top-down method to this system. And it's a system of global governance, which is very, very simple. And when you've got Extinction Rebellion as a lobbying group for global governance, they're part of it. So in other words, say we've got the Occupy movement. Well, the Occupy movement used general assemblies. The same template is rolled out within Extinction Rebellion. In other words, you have facilitated meetings. Facilitators are people who control the narrative of opinion in the meeting, so that the opinion is already decided. Now, we talked earlier about this happening in council meetings. Yes, you're a facilitator and a co-facilitator. So it doesn't matter whether it's a protest group or the council. It's the same thing. The outcome's already decided. So there's a great term that I use, and it's this. The globalists need the anti-globalists to implement their policies. The anti-globalists have nothing to do. So they need something to protest about, right? So they're given their protest. You're going to protest that the government isn't doing enough about global warming. Well, global warming was the idea of two billionaires. Okay? Now people go, well, that can't be true. It is true. That's where it came from, right? And they set up the scientific community that proved it, that anthropogenic global warming is real, which is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out of the Rio Conference in 92. Now, this may seem like mind-blowing to some people, but we're going into great detail with it in the talks. It's a very simple concept. Basically, Extinction Rebellion, not a protest group, they're a lobbying group, and the idea of it is that people are given their protest. You want to protest? There's your placards, go and do it. It started with the People's Assembly. I don't know if you remember that, People's Assembly. Yes. That was basically when I was at a place called the People's Voice, which was a TV station that didn't last very long.
I remember that.
A fella came up and he was organising what was meant to be a protest in Trafalgar Square. Now, I looked at the poster and thought, it's not a protest. It was basically getting people together for a police exercise to get the police ready for the citizens, the People's Assembly. Now, the People's Assembly were doing demonstrations against privatisation of the NHS, whatever you want, okay? So what happened was this. You were given your protest, you're given your banners, and you're taken to London on a coach. You walk around all day, you get supervised by the police, very worthy people from the unions come up and beat their chest, then you get taken home, they take your banners off you, and then they take you home again. What happens then is that you need some friction. You need some demonstration friction. So you bring in the security services to rattle the barriers, dressed in black, as anarchists who've just turned up, right? And that's the resistance. So in other words, we're talking about a stage-managed government operation. There is no protest. If me and you, you're very right, if me and you went out to protest, we'd have our doors kicked in the next day. That's how it works in this country. And people who don't believe that have never protested about anything. So if you protest about anything or raise your head above the parapet, you'll find out that you live in a totalitarian system. That the UK is a totalitarian system, and I've got very, very good evidence for that, and I know exactly how it works because I've been up against it. And I can tell you one thing, that the UK is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And that's a fact. It's an absolute fact, because the people who think we live in a democracy have never raised their head above the parapet or had anything done to them by the state. The state in this country is absolutely draconian. And the idea that a protest group such as Extinction Rebellion can stop, glue themselves to buildings, breach national security is an absolute joke. It would never happen.
And also close down a bridge. Now, if you or I were to close down a bridge, what would happen is we'd be taken off in seconds by the police. The Extinction Rebellion could stay there for hours, for days, and you know the police turn a blind eye to it. It's just it's a really
been instructed. The police have been instructed, and it's a very interesting thing actually, because the police were told that they had to facilitate these people. It was the same at Occupy. Now, the thing is, when you're talking about Extinction Rebellion, you're not talking about a protest group, right? It's an organized lobbying group. So they have to be allowed to lobby, because they're lobbying for global governance. They're not lobbying against the government, they're lobbying for the government. The globalists need the globalists.
And the people that's been brainwashed in it don't know that.
No. I mean, the useful idiots, as the Soviets call them, are the people on the ground. Now, they may be very well intentioned, but the level of propaganda that those people are under is on a much bigger level than the Soviet Union, because in the Soviet Union, most people knew that state TV and the government should not be trusted. In this country, there is not that level of knowledge. So what you've got is you've got a media which controls the narrative of everything, or tries to, and then everything outside it gets demonized. So in other words, you've got a whole section of what people see, which is just one controlled narrative. There is nothing outside that narrative. So when you're controlling the narrative of public opinion, you're basically you demonize everything outside it. So in other words, I mean, it's absolutely bizarre, right? Because now you've got people who say things like David Bellamy, for instance, died today or yesterday. There's a obituary today, and I glanced through it in the Guardian because I knew what they were going to bring up, and they did. So we've got the intelligence services narrative saying that basically because he denied global warming, he was aligning himself, or people who were extreme right wingers would align themselves with him. Absolute joke. I mean, how can the weather have anything to do with politics? But of course it is, because this is a politicized system. So globalization is a politicized system. Global warming is a political it's a mixture of development and environmentalism. So that's why it's brought in. So basically you want to control the environmentalism and you want to give them something. So you give them benefits, you give them carbon taxes, you give them draconian legislation, you control and restrict every part of their lives, but it's on the back of the common good, which is to save the planet. It's a genius simplicity idea. And when you take it down and look at how it's implemented, it's very simple. If it wasn't simple, it wouldn't work, because there'd be fracture points within the system. But because the system is so simple, it means that you've got a totalitarian system which puts itself across as communitarian. Now, according to Etsy Amiotsi, I think his name, Amorotsi, something his name is, the one who invented communitarianism. Etso Amioto, I think his name is. Well, he couldn't even define what it was. So this is fascinating, because you've got people who they use the word community. No, the words have been stripped of their meaning. So the word sustainable doesn't mean anything. The word community doesn't mean anything. The word inclusive doesn't mean anything. In fact, inclusivity is about dividing and ruling. Because if you've got a community, then everyone feels part of it. But once you empower groups or perceived groups, it's like the LBGT thing, right? What you're doing is you're creating groups that aren't even groups. So you can maybe get one person who'd identify as that before, yeah? Now you've got a whole group. Now, interestingly, what happens then is the mass will control themselves. So there was an interesting thing that happened in my friend's pub. The doorman there said, "All right, boys and girls, and anyone in between, it's time to go." Okay. So there was a trans person there, right? Now the trans person didn't get offended. They laughed, yeah? But the people with the trans person got offended on the trans person's behalf. So that's what it's about. It's about massive virtue signaling. And that's mind control. Yeah. So then you've got them enforcing their opinion on everybody else who wants to have a laugh. So once you take humor out of the equation, you're also bringing in very totalitarian mind control, because humor will break mind control and get to the truth. So it's all interesting, you know, but it's very simple when it comes down to it, I think.
Because have you noticed in society, I mean, we used to, 40 odd years ago, you sport for choice with humour. You go on the television, there's a lot of humour. Now, there's no humour. It's all very politically correct. The BBC humour, I just gave up. I looked at it, I thought I'd lost a sense of humour. It's just not humour at all. It's very cold, simple, because everybody's frightened of offending somebody. And let's face it, humour is bad taste and it is offending people, isn't it?
It becomes identitarian. So in other words, you get your Asian comedian who's going to talk about his life with his Asian family. You get your West Indian who talks about the West Indian thing. So basically there's no crossover. So once you bring identitarianism into it, then you're reducing the comedy, because the comedy often comes in through conflict. And unless you've got that conflict and misunderstanding, then you haven't got the humour, because most really good comedy is about someone misunderstanding something, again, completely the wrong idea.
That's right.
And that's a very powerful source of comedy. So when I see these feeds from BBC about this comedy, it's desperate, because it's not spontaneous. It's not coming from any true area of joy. It's coming from a contrived area. And it comes across as being very self-conscious and also very nasty, a lot of it. It's got this nasty undercurrent, which is very uncomfortable and doesn't really make you laugh. So, I mean, it's interesting, because when we go back to, you know, in the 80s, when people like Ben Elton were out, all this kind of so-called alternative comedy came in. And there was a big backlash against that then. So you had the sort of northern comedians. And then you had the people like Joe Brand attacking Bernard Manning, and Bernard Manning coming back with some choice descriptions of her, you know. And his descriptions of her are actually, you know. But it's kind of, that clash happened then, but we're beyond that now. We're into the brave new world, and everything has to be done with kid gloves, and it's all about identitarianism. So basically, you've got a police state controlling humour, and you can't have that.
Yes, you're right. I mean, let's face it, they've broken up the family unit, which was one of their first ideals. That's what communism does, because then the person can then identify, look at their family. The government can then be their family, can't they? And, you know, I was talking earlier today about why, and it still puzzles me, why the yellow vests are taken off in France, but it's, excuse my language, I think anyone I've explained it, it's like a wet fart in this country. It's sort of people that have turned up and very well meaning, and it'll rain and all went home. And I'm wondering whether it be, I mean, I put it down earlier to they are more of a rural country, and people that live in the country have to think for themselves. But I'm wondering whether the family unit hasn't been destroyed in France as in England. That's another thought. I don't know. It's puzzling me. You know, by now we should have people standing up, letting people go through the Thames Tunnel free of charge, and you know, things like that. No, it's nothing. Everybody's just sort of.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because the Dartford Bridge was owned by a company called Sanef, and they are in charge of all the toll roads in France. That's another issue. I've been questioning that for quite some time, but I think it's been sold up again. But what's interesting about this, yes, you've got a very good point. Now, the French have a different attitude. They are much more individualistic in the way they think. Because if you go to, say, I used to do gigs in France, and you go to a gig over there, and it's completely off the wall. It's not kind of one thing or the other. They mix things up, and they have a very strong sense of individualism over there, which would be a very good thing. Now, so yes, the people there are much more determined. The people here are very dependent on the state for their ideas, but conversely, the people here think that they are independent of the state. And that's a very dangerous thing. So in other words, the people in the UK think that they're thinking for themselves. And that's a huge problem because they can't separate the propaganda from reality. That's a huge, huge problem here. Whereas the French have a natural instinct to go, that's rubbish, I don't believe it. But the yellow vest thing is so persistent because, yes, you're right. A lot of people live in rural areas, and those people have a more down-to-earth kind of view of life, I think, and a more practical view of life. Whereas if you've got urbanites, people who live in London, they're very dependent on the state for everything. They don't have to think for themselves as much. And also, I don't think Extinction Rebellion in France would take off like it has here. It's got a hold there. But the yellow vests are still going. Now, the other thing is that you're talking about real extremes over there. Because here you've got Extinction Rebellion doing yoga on Westminster Bridge and lying down in Waitrose. I mean, why can't they lie down in Lidl? You know, it has to be Waitrose, doesn't it? So you can do your shopping. And over there, they're getting their eyes blown out and getting really badly beaten up. I mean, the injuries that were coming out of there were horrendous. And that jerk had his hand blown off. He picked up that what they call them, those fireball things that they were. And he picked one up and it blew up and he blew his hand off, and that was on camera. You saw his hand was blown off. It was on RT on feed. It blew his hand off. It just had nothing left. It was just a stump, you know. And you just don't see things like that in this country. People are so mollycoddled. They don't see things like that. They're not used to that level of violence from the state here. But conversely, the state is more draconian here. In actual fact, it's just that it appears not to be. So I think there's a huge problem and disconnect. Yeah, I mean, the yellow vest thing wouldn't happen here. People are too entitled in this country, and despite what people say, I know there's a lot of hardship here and people are on the edge. But at the end of the day, they've still got their big screen TVs and they've got their nanny state, which is, you know, I think that's a big difference. I really do, because I think the French are more individualistic in that sense.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think that on that note, this has actually been brilliant. You answered my question. I've been pondering this for ages. You know, please come back, and I hope you come. Well, I'd like to have you as a regular guest if that's okay.
We can get to a lot of stuff. I mean, I can go into great detail on this. I'm sure you can. We've done a few shows together before on Windows on the World, and there's a lot of things I'd like to go into, which I don't go into on the shows. The shows I tend to keep very tight, and I want to get out sort of information that's a bit looser and go into different areas. So it's been really good. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. And I'll tell you something I'd like to go into is the RRBA, because I think that was infiltrated, but that's another question. That's the Royal Institute of British Architects. But, yes. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to our viewers. And you're going on, please look on Mark's website, which is Windows on the World.net, and he will.
And you can help with the Patreon if you want to.
Sorry? Oh,
we're on Patreon.
Patreon as well. And he's no doubt coming to a town near you with the bigger picture. So please watch out for that. Thank you very much, and good night.
Thanks, Chris.